Our second speaker is Dr. Katherine Manthorne, Professor of Modern Art of the Americas at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Her specialty is Latin and North American art, with a particular expertise in 19th century travel art and women artists. She's currently at work on a forthcoming book scheduled to come out in spring of 2021 on the 19th century American artist Eliza Pratt Greatorex, the subject of her talk today. Katherine.
Could you put on the first slide? Well, good afternoon. Thank you to everyone who made this event such a complete success. And I think I should say thank you to all of you who have stayed here the entire day. Just to explain my slide here, you can see I'm talking about Eliza Greatorex. She was born in Ireland. Then she came to the United States and became a naturalized citizen. And this may not be the flag of the United States that you recognize, but this was the flag of the United States in the 1860s and 70s when there were only 30 states, when Eliza Greatorex was at her prime. And of course, the French flag, I think you recognize. She comes to France for very important experiences. Next. Connaissez-vous cette femme? Do you know this woman? Do you recognize her? Just raise your hand if anyone actually knew about her before today. So it seems that she's not very well known. But in the 1860s and 70s, she was the most famous artist in New York. And as you can see here on my slide, I indicate that the National Academy of Design, which was the most prestigious organization for artists in the United States, she was the only female member in this time. So just to explain, she was born in Ireland in 1819. She died in Paris in 1897. In between, she moved to the United States. She married an English musician named Henry Greatorex, and with him, they had 3 children. He then died, and she was left with no money and no way to support her children but through her art. So over the course of her career, she tries many different strategies to try to do that. Next. If you knew any work by her, it would be this one. This is the most reproduced work, The Pond at Cernay-la-Ville. So she's working in France, making this etching, and then it became well known because it was included in a special compendium of different etchings from 1880, and so it circulated widely. Next. So this, I'm just showing, this is going to be the cover of my book. I have to mention this. But just to explain, so her career, she starts out as a landscape painter, more or less in the Hudson River mode. And that itself was unusual for women at the time to be landscape painters. She then decides to give up painting for pen and ink drawings of structures from old New York. Then in the third and final phase of her career, when she was 60 years old, she turns to plein air etchings. So observers often mention that she was extremely cultured, and other people talked about the fact that her work showed a very European flavor. So these are not words that were usually used for American artists. They were not usually called cultured, men or women. So a lot of this was due to the fact that in spite of having 3 children and no money, she spent quite a bit of time in France. Next. So this phase then, we'll talk about the fact that she starts in the Hudson River mode, which was the famous school of landscape in New York, and then strives to become more versed in the Barbizon style. Next. So as a landscape painter, she began working in that Hudson River mode, but she soon realizes that she needs more intense training in outdoor painting. So she decides to move to go to France, to go to Barbizon, and to work with Lambinet. But here I'm just showing you a picture of her friend. Her name is Fidelia Bridges. And this is the way that the women would have dressed to paint outdoors. You can see it looks a little bit like a military style. The skirt is a bit shorter because she's outside, and what looks like a little laptop computer is, of course, her sketching equipment. So Eliza Greatorex, too, although older, would have had to dress a special way to work outside. So this was a very important aspect. But we have to remind ourselves that women at the time, it was not so easy for them to become landscape painters. If you had to go out and make a trip to go to a special place you wanted to paint, or you wanted to stay outdoors all day, this was not necessarily expected behavior for women. So they had to really rise to the challenge. Next. So this is a painting that Greatorex did when she was in Barbizon in Chevreuse. Wash Day at Chevreuse. It's a good example of this phase of her work, obviously inspired by the little village outside of Paris that she seemed to really love. Next one. This is the work by Lambinet, the person who became her teacher. So you can see this evocative painting of a cottage along a riverbank, and the figure of the woman here in the foreground. But so we have details of human life, but the real subject is the landscape. And you can see, too, the way in which he paints the feathery treatment of the trees. These are things that Greatorex started to learn from her experiences in France. Because if you know American painting of this time, it's very hard, it's very linear, it's very detailed, it's not so soft as this. Next. So when we can just look at, this is one of the details of Greatorex painting, so you can see she includes the women doing their laundry, and here you can see the boiling water. So she does include those details, but it's very small, and the real interest is the light on the trees and the sort of depiction of the foliage. So this is really what she learns at this period in France. This tells us that she's really beginning to switch from Hudson River to a more Barbizon style that was coming into fashion in the 1860s. Next. So this is a painting by another woman, really nothing to do with my talk except to say that Greatorex exhibits at the Salon when she's in Paris, and she always identifies herself in the catalog as the pupil or the student of Lambinet. So this is the link with the French school that she was very eager to emphasize. Next. So the next phase then, we'll be looking at her growing interest in the changes that are going on in New York City and the relationship that that has to what's going on in Paris. So she's shifting from landscape painting, as you'll see, to graphic work, to pen and ink. And she becomes very concerned about the radical changes that are going on in the city. Old buildings are being destroyed. Ugly new buildings, in her mind, ugly new buildings are being built. And so when she returns from Paris to New York, she starts to think about a new project. Next. So, of course, she comes back to Paris in 1867 for the Exposition Universelle, and during this time, she becomes increasingly aware of the destruction of old Paris, spearheaded, of course, by Baron Haussmann. She recognizes then the parallels that are going on between between Paris and New York, that for different reasons, both cities are losing their old structures and changing with broad boulevards and new modern buildings. So she learns of the great pictorial projects that are going on in France. People like Marville, you see here, doing photographic documentation, almost like a before and after. What did Paris look like for hundreds of years, and what is it changing to? And here you can see these two pictures, the area around Garnier's opera, which was being cleared to build the opera, and of course the other building is a more quaint old building that he was recording. So Greatorex is very inspired by this. Oh, sorry. Next. Then she begins this new project, which you can see is called Old New York, from the Battery to Bloomingdale, so which is not Bloomingdale department store, if you know the store. But it's going from the very tip of Manhattan Island, which is still called the Battery, up to the north end of the island. So she publishes this in 1875. It's a whole compendium of about 80 images of different buildings in New York that had been destroyed. She literally, as she hears, oh, this building is going to be torn down, she takes her pen and ink and she rushes to the spot, and she makes drawings of the buildings as they're being torn down. And in some cases, her drawings are among the few records that we have of these buildings. Next. So I particularly chose this building. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the story related to the Summerendijk house, but this house stood at 75th Street and what is now Broadway until, if you can believe it, until 1868. And you can see here the reference to Louis Philippe. I selected this one particularly because I thought you might be interested in this. Louis Philippe, Duc d'Orléans and future King of France, spent over 3 years in exile in America. Many stories were repeated about his New World adventures, but none was more sort of improbable than his days as a school teacher in New York City. Many stories were told about the fact that Louis Philippe taught school in New York, but if you actually look up the history, you discover that he was not in New York very long. He was in Philadelphia that was more his base, and he traveled around the country, but for some reason, everyone loved the idea that the future King of France was a poor immigrant who had to teach school in New York. So this house became very famous. Can I have the next one? And even, you can see, there are pictures of Louis Philippe teaching his class in this building. So this is just an example of the kind of mix of legend and reality that goes into the preservation of the historic houses and the folklore mixed with the depictions of these houses. Next, please. But here you can see this comparison. Greatorex's image is in the upper screen, and in the lower right, you can see another artist depicted the same place. Now, you think for a minute about how crazy this is, almost at the same time, right? So Greatorex always puts trees around her buildings. To me, it signifies the fact that she's suggesting that they're back in olden days, and it gives it a different look. Here you can see the other artist, Sarony, shows the telegraph poles, the paved street, but for her, it's more rustic, it's more pictorial. So this is very typical of the ways that she tried to capture the quaintness and the history of this place. Next, please. So finally, the third phase is the plein air etching. So around the age of 60, she reinvents herself for the third and last time in the pursuit of outdoor etching. And next. So the image that I showed you before, this is an example of the kind of thing that she was doing. I mean, it's crazy because on the screen it's blown up to be very large, but in fact it's just a very small work, because you would take the plate, the etching plate, and put it on your lap and you would be sitting outside. So it's really just a small image. Next, please. So she set out once more for France and ultimately became a leading figure in the etching revival. And here you can see this is, it seems odd, but there were actually not very many opportunities to do etching in America, not even in New York. You required, etching, the presses, a very special expertise. So she was trying to do it herself, but she wasn't having very much success. So there were, of course, manuals. This is the most famous manual by Lalande. It was translated into English in 1880, but much sooner than that, it was published in France in 1866. We know that Greatorex could read French, so she probably read it earlier. But of course, if any of us have tried to read a book and make art just from reading the book, it's not so easy. So she wanted to come back to France, and she actually studied with Lalande. She had contacts with people who helped her, and so she came back and she had this third phase of her career where she makes these different images. Next. So just to remind you, to show you, this is work by Lalande. You can see why she probably would have liked him. The lower screen, his pictures of the old buildings, the upper screen, the landscape, they seem to have a lot of sympathy with each other and interest. She was very interested in his work. So this is she did many etchings in this period, and there were two very famous exhibitions in the United States in 1880 and then in 1887 that really showed that many Americans were involved in this new revival of etching that, of course, had been around for a long time, but she was considered one of the pioneers. Next. So just as an epilogue, I wanted to talk about her two daughters, both of whom became artists as well. So just to show the contrast of how Eliza Greatorex herself, the mother, had to fashion her own education. She, comes to Barbizon and she tries to find Lambanet. She is interested in the images of old Paris. Then she connects with Lalande, but all of that was very informal. She had to do it herself, but her daughters had the advantage of working at the Académie Julienne and studying with Carlos Duran. Next. So as we've been hearing for the past 2 days, women were excluded from studying at the École des Beaux-Arts until very late in the century, and they were forced to seek places in private ateliers. And for that reason, this, of course, famous work now by Bashkirtsev of the Atelier Julienne, and actually this was painted in around the same time that Greatorex's two daughters were probably in the class, although I don't actually recognize them there. But so this was just an example of the kind of work, of the kind of ways that women acquired their education. Next. So her two daughters came to Paris. This is one of them, Kathleen, and you can see, oh, I'm sorry, this is Eleanor. And you can see that their studio is a kind of typical setup as a typical studio with their paintings and different accoutrements that they would have in the studio. The next. And this is Kathleen, the other daughter, and you can see, I just like the idea that she's sitting between the piano and the paintings because her father had been a musician and a composer, and her mother was a painter. So it's sort of is a posed image of this kind of creativity. But in any case, just to conclude then, so Europe and especially Paris offered American women advantages beyond what we've been talking about, beyond curriculum and training. Ever practical, Eleanor and Kathleen explained that in Europe, it was much easier for women to live more cheaply, and even more important, they didn't feel the pressure of having to find a husband. They didn't feel like they had to get married, that it was more acceptable to be single. So just to read you one little passage that Eleanor wrote. But the ways of living are difficult in the United States for women art students, very, very trying to one who must spend thought and labor on her study, not on how she can live if she has no money. Europe here is far beyond us. A girl can enter a cafe, you can go to a beer garden, you can order your meals in your room. She can hire someone to come and help her clean. So all of this makes it much easier to dedicate yourself to your art. So that was what was so important to her. There's a lack of fellowship among artists in the United States, she says, but here in Europe, artists have many more things that bring them together. Next. So this is just the last slide I wanted to show you. This is one of the ways that Eliza Greatorex signed her name and a little picture of herself. So at each stage, Eliza Greatorex traveled to the French capital, seeking to fill gaps in her American art education. So I think her career provides a case study for analyzing how a woman of the 1860s through the 1880s, desiring an art education, managed to put together a very self-fashioned curriculum on an international scale with a mix of all these different things that we've been talking about, and in the end, to become to have a kind of successful career that lasted several decades and evolved into different stages. So, thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. Thank you. I want to thank all three of you for your excellent presentations that were united in their exploration of how women took their artistic training in France and used it to advance their careers in the United States, albeit in very different ways, as you've shown. I'm going to start by asking all three of you questions, and then we're going to open the floor to your questions. So Heather, I'm going to start with you. We're going to go in order of presentation. I'm curious to know what the art scene in Utah was in the late 19th century for men, because you explained how and why women came to the forefront, but I'm really curious to know if the men had something similar, whether it was in Paris or otherwise.
Sure. So in 1890, 3 men were sent to Paris to train for the express purpose of becoming the best artists that they could to come back and decorate the new church temples and buildings there. So they paved the way for the next generation of women. But this was 3, and then 1 joined them later, and they were here for 2 or 3 years because the Salt Lake Temple needed to be finished by 1893, so they were called back to quickly paint the murals there. And then very few men went afterwards, and I think in large part, the women that I spoke about almost exclusively were single, and so that they had more freedom to do that. And also the men were going on church missions, and that was kind of their time away was that kind of service. So the men also, for reasons that I think are part cultural and in terms of American culture, but even this frontier culture, saw art as being a feminine domain, and one in which the idea of refinement and purification, and we see this happen here in Europe as well, it's the domain of women, and so they no longer want it. So women fill that vacuum, so to speak. And to this day, the Utah art scene is dominated by women artists in terms of directors of museums and in art departments and so on, excepting my university, which is not quite that way.
Thank you. Katherine, I was struck by the fact that Greatorex doesn't go to Paris to train once, but would return. And it just made me wonder, is that as uncommon as it seems to me? Was she somewhat exceptional in what you're aware of Americans going, that she would continue to go to advance her training throughout her career?
Well, it's true. I mean, somebody like, you have expatriates, somebody like Mary Cassatt basically leaves the United States and remains for the rest of her career in France, whereas Greatorex went back and forth. And I think maybe that was partly because she did have children to take care of. And so when the first time she went, her sister actually took her 3 children and took care of them for a year and a half, while she came the first time to go and study at Barbizon. And if you think about that moment, she left and the Civil War broke out in the United States. And to think about your children being at home during the war while you're over in another country, I think, just the stress of that must have been quite severe. But I think on the other hand, she was driven by the fact that she was a widow, her husband had died, and she was trying to sort of reinvent herself as an artist who would be more fashionable, I think, from the Hudson River to the Barbizon style that was becoming more, better, more in taste in that period. So she goes back, and then the second time, she's interested in this idea of old New York, and many American artists went to Paris in 1867 for the exposition, and Winslow Homer, that you saw, that image of the people sketching in the Louvre and others, came for that period and then went back again. And then the third time, sadly, she did that whole project about old New York, and she had spent 8 years doing it, producing this large folio book that had all her images and then text explaining the significance of all the different buildings. Then she produces it, and of course, it wasn't as financially successful as it might have been. So literally, she had to sell all her belongings, all her drawings. She had collected old furniture. When she went to the sites of some of the old buildings, she would take like panels from it, or some kind of like the pulpit of the church she acquired. So she had this whole big collection, all of which was sold, and with the idea that when she came back to Europe, she could live more cheaply. But I think also she had come from Ireland. She lived in Ireland until she was 20, and so she had a different sense of history and culture. And I think in a funny way, New York, even then, must have been very shocking. You know, they would just have a beautiful old church and knock it down to build Tiffany's jewelry store, or, you know, even in this period. So I think it was kind of shocking to her. So in a way, she needed to go back to nature. She would leave the city to go to nature, but then she would also leave New York to go to Europe. And I think that was an important dialogue that she was having all through her career.
Thanks. Emily, I was struck by the idea of reasons why bourgeois, as you so explained and sort of thought through, would switch from painting to sculpture. And it's true that Abex was described as a masculine style. Maybe that's a reason that she might have thought. But of course, I think in the States, the system was very much based on, you know, sort of British and French academic system, that sculpture stereotypically, I think, was still seen as very masculine, even in the 1940s and 50s in the US. So I was curious to know if you think that bourgeois' switch to sculpture could be connected to sort of new freedoms or social freedoms, whether real or imagined, that she might have had, of the kind of freedom of leaving behind tradition and then being in New York in this moment to maybe gravitate towards a medium that might still have seemed not a smart way to go as a professional artist in France.
Alors, j'ai mis en valeur le fait que son passage par Reiter l'avait peut-être déterminé dans un engagement à chercher un travail, à chercher une pratique artistique qui impliquait un engagement corporel, physique important qu'elle visiblement elle voulait avoir dans sa pratique. Je pense au fond que le passage à la sculpture, il se fait vraiment dans les années 42, 41, 42, 43, sur le toit de cet immeuble, et que le contexte, alors en effet, on peut dire elle a changé, elle est exilée, ça donne effectivement une forme de liberté. Je pense qu'elle est surtout beaucoup confrontée dans sa vie mondaine, dans sa vie de femme de Robert Goldwater, à la fois aux pratiques surréalistes qui sont en cours à New York, ne serait-ce que la recherche par les surréalistes, l'intérêt pour l'art amérindien ou de la côte du Nord-Ouest. Elle est confrontée en fait à des artistes qu'elle n'aime pas, qu'elle critique, qui s'intéressent à des types d'art qui par ailleurs l'intéressent et sur lesquels travaille son mari. Donc je pense que l'arrivée de la sculpture comme assemblage, comme fétiche, mêlée à toute une dimension psychologique qui est bien connue, hein, de solitude et de vouloir créer en fait des sortes de substituts. Et elle n'est pas du tout dupe de ce processus. Enfin, je pense qu'elle sait ce qu'elle est en train de faire. Tout ça fait le passage. C'est vraiment difficile dans le processus créatif d'un artiste de savoir pourquoi est-ce qu'à un moment donné il décide de faire quelque chose. Mais c'est sûr qu'il y avait ce toit, il y avait des matériaux en bois. Il y avait une ville très horizontale qu'on retrouve dans It Disappeared into Complete Silence, et il y avait un intérêt pour, disons, les arts non occidentaux autour d'elle, autour desquels il y avait des tensions et des discussions, et qui sont plutôt de la sculpture, de l'assemblage, etc. Donc je pense que ça la pousse vers la sculpture, et je pense que la sculpture demeure aux États-Unis un genre très masculin. Ce que vous dites est complètement juste, mais alors la peinture est très chargée aussi. Très, très, très chargé. Enfin, je ne l'ai pas montré, le Life de 1949, où Pollock est devant, je ne sais plus comment s'appelle cette œuvre très, très, très connue, où Pollock est devant je ne sais plus, enfin, devant un de ses grands murals. Et donc, la mise en scène de l'artiste peintre comme une figure très virile et l'importance de la peinture, etc., enfin, que tout le monde connaît bien ici. C'est juste que je ne voulais pas dire que ça l'autorise à passer à la sculpture, mais simplement que la polarisation, la charge est différente en France.
Merci. Bon, on peut inviter des questions de l'audience en français ou en anglais, et peut-être entre nous trois, on arrive à bien répondre.
Ça, c'est une question pour mes deux compatriotes américaines. Déjà, est-ce que vous parlez français? Parce que je peux faire en anglais, mais aussi en français, parce que je pense que beaucoup de gens ici parlent français.
Peut-être on peut faire les deux.
Do you
s'il vous
speak
plaît.
French? You too? You understand if I speak French?
I understand.
Okay. Parce que...
Pas les deux, en fait. Donc, peut-être vous voulez demander dans les deux langues, si vous pouvez.
Oui, je peux. OK, d'accord.
Merci.
Je suis une expat américaine que j'habite ici depuis plus 35 ans. Et j'étais attirée à la France à cause de la joie de vivre, l'art de vivre et l'art dans la vie. Et aussi, comme vous avez dit, les siècles derrière, il y a certaines femmes qui ont trouvé une certaine liberté ici, moi personnellement, on ne trouve pas en Amérique. Some women find, well, I did, when you're alone, you find a certain freedom, such as going to a cafe. You can go to the cafe, you can have a coffee, you can have a wine, you can bring your dog, you can bring your kids, you can read a book, you can draw. Dans un café, on peut faire tout. Mais en Amérique, dans un bar américain, surtout à Utah, pas à New York, j'habitais aussi à New York, mais dans l'Amérique profonde, j'étais jamais à l'aise d'aller toute seule dans un bar parce qu'on est considéré un peu une femme perdue, une femme mauvais caractère. Est-ce que ça a changé? Je parle surtout, pas à New York, mais plutôt in Utah. That changed.
I would agree with you about the freedoms of just not having domestic cares, and also American women were seen as more bold and brash and perhaps licentious, and seen and still seen, perhaps. And also, you have Paris is an enormous city with so many opportunities versus a fairly rural kind of environment. I would say that as a woman who lives in Utah, I feel the same sort of freedom when I come here, as well. That there are I'm free from certain responsibilities at home and at work, and able to explore different parts of myself. But in terms of the state, is that sort of where you wanted me to go? I do think there was a retrenchment, and that some of those opportunities and freedoms and liberties that could even be enjoyed there in the course of the 20th century, that waned. And so I think we're in a moment of, we're actually celebrating the fact that women in Utah were the first to vote in state elections in 1870. So, which is not well known. Of course, that was revoked when statehood wasn't granted, and there were concerns about women voting as their husbands told them to, and not exercising true agency. So that is a very rambling answer to a big question about the freedoms that one may feel here versus there. Thank you.
Other questions? Autre question? Devant.
Une question qui concerne à la fois Louise Bourgeois et Greatorex. Ce qui me frappe, c'est le caractère discontinu en fait du travail de ces deux artistes, et c'est quelque chose que j'ai souvent retrouvé dans la carrière des artistes femmes, à la différence des hommes qui vont définir assez tôt une sorte de style, signature, et qui vont suivre ce style, alors que les femmes s'autorisent ou sont forcées à quelque chose qui est de l'ordre de la pas de l'incohérence, mais je veux dire d'une forme de diversité stylistique, soit qu'elle passe d'un travail commercial ou destiné à vivre à quelque chose qui est plus important pour elle, mais plus difficile à vendre, ou alors qu'elle soit forcée pour différentes raisons à avoir une forme de discontinuité, ce que tu appelles quelque chose de sinueux. Et je voudrais vous interroger toutes les deux là-dessus. Should I do it in English? Did you get what I said?
Did you get what? Did you get what?
No.
Okay, I was reflecting on the fact that a lot of women artists, from my experience, have discontinuous career. They go from one style to another, from one technique to another, more than men artists. And I wonder if it's not, I would be interested in both of your reaction to that.
Well, I think that's quite true that a lot of the men, for example, if we take Greatorex starts as the Hudson River artist, and I might compare her to, Frederick Church or some of the other artists who basically have one style and they continue it for 20 or 30 years. And usually they only had a small window where they were very successful, but they keep more or less doing something similar. And I tend, with the women, there seemed to be more of a sense of the possibility of self-reinvention, that you can, you're not locked into this one mode, that you can experiment. And I think also in the case of Greatorex, she was very spiritual and moral. She wasn't really religious, but she was, so I think that's when she was painting landscape, to me, she started out as maybe thinking that was an acceptable mode of work, but then as she sees what's going on in New York, she's morally outraged. She wants to call attention to this change that's going on, and so I don't think she thinks she's going to stop progress, of course, but she does this book. And she actually writes. I mean, I just found a letter the other day. I've been working on her for 20 years, and I found a letter the other day. She wrote to Governor Tilden of New York, and she said, I'm sending you a copy of my book, and I want you to know realize what is going on in the city, and, you should pay attention to this. So she thought that this was an important call to arms in a way. And then she's making this book, and she's doing these pen and ink drawings. But then how do you reproduce those things? She tried many different methods. She tried somebody photographing her drawings. She tried reproduction by photomechanical means, but she's never happy with that. So then she says, okay, I'm going to learn to etch myself. So I can just make my own, do my own, it can be made in multiples, and she does that. So, I think there's this sense of, it's organic. It's sort of one thing is leading to another. I don't think that she was, people are that she was careerist. She wasn't thinking, oh, I'm going to make more money if I do this. But she was, she was evolving and noticing things around her, and she thought of her art as a way of responding to social issues and the world around her, not just interior creativity, but actually a social responsibility.
Pour Louise Bourgeois, alors les artistes que j'ai cités qui ont des périodes de formation très longues aussi à un moment donné, c'est ce même type de parcours sinueux, et ce sont souvent des artistes qui passent de la peinture à la sculpture. Enfin, il faut revoir dans le détail, mais il y a souvent... Et je suis tout à fait d'accord avec ce que vous venez de dire, agree with you. Et pour Louise Bourgeois, je mettrais en rapport cette longue formation avec son succès tardif. Il y a une caractéristique du travail de Louise Bourgeois qui est celui d'effectivement avoir eu plusieurs périodes qui ne font partie d'aucun courant, qui appartiennent dès le début, comme on le voit, c'est à la fois une sorte de modernisme prolongé, il y a des liens avec le surréalisme, elle se mêle avec l'art conceptuel, à un moment donné elle est exposée, comme tu le sais bien, dans Eccentric Abstraction. Donc elle navigue entre différents projets. Le fait de subir une forme de marginalisation en tant qu'artiste femme, puisque sociologiquement c'est bien prouvé, va de pair avec une forme on ne sait pas quelle est l'œuf ou la poule, mais de liberté à traverser, de ne pas s'intégrer en fait dans tel ou tel courant. Mais ça implique un succès tardif, une formation longue, puis un succès tardif pour Louise Bourgeois.
Bon, je crois qu'on a du temps pour une question finale. Last question.
I hope it's worthy. So I was wondering, thank you all for your presentations. I have a question about Greatorex. I was wondering, there's so many women artists all over the world who are successful in their career. They are recognized, but then for some reason we just lose touch and sight of their work. So as you very poignantly pointed out when you asked that question in the beginning of your presentation, who has heard of this artist? No one raised their hands. When was it and why was it that she became lost in the art historical canon?
Well, now you asked the big question. We might be here all night. So what I think happened is, I don't know if many of you know the term Gilded Age, But in art of the United States, we usually talk about antebellum, before the Civil War, and then from the 1860s to the end of the century is usually called Gilded Age. So what I think really happens is that as corporate America really starts moving along in the 1880s and 1890s, and they begin to have a very specific type of art that they want to to have in their homes. And they have the muralists, and they have certain painters who painted idealized women and things like this. But so the generation before that was much more open. African Americans were painting and exhibiting in the exhibitions. Women had were beginning to become much more prominent. And so I think a lot of these, so if you think about American history, after the Civil War, in political terms, not art, you have the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. So African Americans get the right to vote. You have very many, there's almost a possibility that democracy is really going to exist. I mean, Whitman writes this essay called Democratic Vistas, where he says that the promise of democracy is finally being realized. But then by 1880 or the late 1870s, things start to become more controlled again. The South begins to suffer. African Americans are again being sort of pushed into a different mode, and so are women. So I really think that there was a sort of effort to sort of retell the story in a way that made the Gilded Age look like the logical progression of American art, of course, across the century. So I think, in a way, a lot of these people were the victims of that kind of tidying up of the history that would lead to, abstraction and whatever, modernism.
Well, thank you all very much for your presentations, and thank you all for staying jusqu'au bout, comme quelqu'un a dit avant. Bon, on va prendre une petite pause. On va revenir pour le concert final, et c'était à 18h moins le quart. Bon, merci.